And it really is today at the NDTV World Summit, our very distinguished guest, former UK Prime Minister Lord David Cameron, also was a surprise Foreign Secretary under Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and has lots more ahead. So Lord Cameron here to talk to us with his perspective on the India century. Thank you so much for being at the NDTV World Summit.
Great to be with you, and great to hear Prime Minister Modi's speech. I must say, to have that energy level at the start of your third term is truly impressive. So it's great to be with you.
And of course, a third term is very impressive from a UK perspective.
Well, yes, I made it into a second term, but since then we've had quite a number of prime ministers, and we haven't had anyone having 3 terms since Tony Blair, and before that, obviously, Margaret Thatcher. But no, very impressive, because it means you have the ability to get real change, real things done in a very consistent way, which is what we're seeing here in India.
And of course, when we're talking about the India century, I think the point of the democratic legitimacy any prime minister gets with a mandate like we currently have in India. When we look at India today on the global stage, what is the perception from the West? Do you see it as a global moment of reset?
Well, I think, look, the world at the moment needs, in my view, 3 things. It needs strong economic growth, it needs more democracy, and it needs this green transition to deal with climate change. And India is a shining example of all 3 of those things. And I think we do need a reset. The world has changed hugely since the institutions were set up after the Second World War. And so it's time for a reset, both because you see the rise of India. Now, will this century become probably the world's largest economy at some stage during this century? So obviously we need a reset, and countries like India should be at its heart.
What do you see as this possible reset? I remember in 2015 you talked about India at the UN Security Council. What do you see as the key elements of this reset, with India taking a much more prominent role?
Well, first of all, we do need reform of the United Nations Security Council. It should have, and I made this argument, I think, as far back as 2005. When I became leader of the Conservative Party, India was the first country I visited outside Europe. When I became Prime Minister in 2010, India was the first country I visited outside Europe. I like to think that I was an early believer in the Indian century, and it's great to be back here today. And obviously, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council is something that should be India's right in this changed world. But I think we should be clear that although we need these institutions to be changed, and we need them to reflect global realities, that debate will inevitably take a long time, and we shouldn't wait for that. And that's why it's so good to see India take its place in more informal global institutions like the Quad. I think that's a great move for India, India's role in the G20, the fact now that the G7 regularly invites India to attend almost as a standing member of the G7, as a fellow democracy. These are all good moves, because we need India's perspective on these challenges we face in our world. And perhaps the biggest is this issue of climate change. And you can really see here in India the massive investment in green technology and in carbon reduction, badly needed here in India, but also needed across the world. So that's the sort of reset we need. But obviously it goes much broader than that, because as we speak today, we've got a world of terrible conflict. We've got the war in the Middle East, we've got the situation between Russia and Ukraine, where Prime Minister Modi quite rightly made a visit to Ukraine recently, and we need to try and re-establish some norms of behavior. And I think Ukraine is perhaps the most critical one, because certainly in my political lifetime, I can't think of a clearer example of one country invading another independent sovereign country with absolutely no excuse or justification.
Prime Minister Modi actually going to be in Russia now for the BRICS summit. He visited Ukraine as well. Do you see that India, actually more than any other country, has the credibility, the trust on both sides to actually play a mediator in finding a solution?
Well, it certainly has the credibility, and if there's a role that can be played to bring this conflict to an end, that would be welcome. But it must be done in a way that recognizes Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. And I think one of the things we need in this global reset is to get back to some clear norms This country has suffered terribly from terrorism. So has my own country. We need to have an understanding that there aren't good terrorists and bad terrorists. Terrorism is wrong, particularly in a democratic state. We need to get back to the understanding that a country's borders are or should be inviolable, that the most important thing is the independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. And that's why I think we need this clarity. Russia's invasion was unjustified, illegal, and it breached the independence of a member of the United Nations. We need to get back to that sort of clarity.
Yes,
now, I know in the West we often are accused of double standards, that we've made mistakes in the past, no doubt about that, obviously referring to Iraq. But nonetheless, two wrongs don't make a right. It's time to try and reestablish the importance of these norms.
That's interesting because India has also, of course, said that the West's double standards sometimes extend to the fact that we look at what's happening on our borders and the China issue as well, and often then what we see the perhaps double standards coming from Canada too.
Well, that's why I make the point that I don't want to in any way say to India what India's national interest is. That's for you to determine. But it would seem to me that the importance of borders, the importance of territorial integrity, matters hugely to this country as it matters to every country in the world. So when you see the most grotesque violation of a country's borders, as you have with Ukraine, I think we all need to stand together and say to Russia that what has happened is wrong. As you say, India might well be in a position to try and provide some mediation, but it must, in my view, be mediation based on the fact that Putin cannot be allowed to take territory by force and be rewarded by that, because we know from our history, if you reward people taking territory by force, they come back and take some more.
Just to take that point and shift really, that where do you think, and Prime Minister Modi also made this point, that he came to the UK in 2015 and you were with him at that Wembley Rockstar reception. Tell us about that and your interactions with Prime Minister Modi. And for you, it was a bit of a dream come true as well at Wembley.
It's something you don't forget, because in the UK, if you're lucky as a Prime Minister or a party leader, you might, at your party conference, you might speak to 3,000 people or maybe 4,000 people. But to go to Wembley Stadium, introducing Prime Minister Modi, where you're speaking to 85,000 people, that was quite an occasion. But the thing I remember best about the occasion now is something I found out afterwards. So I made an introduction. My speech was very short, and in my introduction I said that my party, the Conservative Party, we'd had the first woman Prime Minister, we'd had the first Jewish Prime Minister, and I was sure that one day we'd have the first British Indian Prime Minister. And when I said that, I didn't know that there was a young man in the back row, many seats back, called Rishi Sunak, and he was there that day. Wow. And then became, as I didn't predict it would be him, but I predicted it would be someone, and he was at that speech with Prime Minister Modi, and then became, historically, Britain's Prime Minister, and it was an honour to serve under him. Prime Minister Modi made a very powerful speech. I remember he was talking about the relationship between Britain and India and the importance of our collaboration, and he had this great riff on tea, movies and finance, and it was Brooke Bond, James Bond, Rupee Bond. And I remember that. I thought it was a very snappy soundbite, but it was a great occasion. It was great to welcome him, and I think it really did sort of cement what I've been trying to do since 2005, which is to say that India and the UK should have a special partnership. Obviously, there's a huge amount of history that we have to come to terms with and get over, but the links of language and culture and people and interests, and I think values as well, the world's largest democracy and one of the world's oldest democracies, we do have some very strong common interests, and we should work to expand them.
Tell us a little bit about Rishi Sunak, because of course in India it was a moment of great interest and pride when somebody who's of Indian origin became Prime Minister, but you made a surprise return as Foreign Secretary. Why did you do that, and what was it like working with Rishi?
Well, I admired him. I thought he was a very good Prime Minister. He's extremely hard-working, highly intelligent, very capable, a brilliant chairman, very good at bringing people together, and he asked me to be Foreign Secretary, and I almost surprised myself by saying yes immediately. But it was a time which we still have with the situation in Ukraine, the situation in the Middle East. it seemed to me someone who'd been Prime Minister could play a role in that, and it was an honor to be asked. I think generous of him to ask me, and reflected that he was keen to have experienced people around him. And he was highly capable. He had a very difficult inheritance. We'd had this year of three
falling like dominoes.
I think the year of three prime ministers was probably impossible to recover from, but Rishi brought stability. He got inflation down from 11% to 2%. He strengthened our relations with Europe through the Windsor Framework. He reached out to countries like India and built strong partnerships. He did a good job in his time, and he should be proud of that. But I think we can be proud of the fact that in Britain, someone whose parents had arrived in Britain from India, that, you know, within 2 generations, he's got the most important job in the country. And I think that reflects well on Britain. And to be fair to Rishi, would always say the great thing about Britain is how unremarkable it is. Mm-hmm. And I would always say to him, no, it is remarkable. It's a great testament to our country and to your talent that this is possible and that this has happened. And I was proud to serve with him.
Absolutely. And who knows, with Kamala Harris, so Indian origin politicians having a bit of a moment. Let's see how that goes. But just to ask on the greater relationship, because of course, Prime Minister Boris Johnson promised there would be an FTA by Diwali. Many Diwalis have come and gone. We've got another Diwali soon.
Yes.
When do you actually see that happening, and what's holding it up?
Well, actually, this is one promise Boris made that I hope, actually I won't get into that.
Is it the only one you agreed with?
No, I really agree with it. It is a pity it hasn't happened. I think it hasn't happened for a good reason, which is Britain and India, I think, both understand that you only get one chance to make an FTA. So if you've got to make it, you've got to make it a good one. And that means both sides have to put more on the table. We're only going to do this once. And my plea, which I'll be making to the Foreign Minister this afternoon when I see him, is the deal. Britain is one of the most pro-free trade countries in Europe. When we were in the EU, we were always the ones pushing for the trade deals. So I think there's an opportunity for India. The deal you do with us will be the shining city on the hill, as it were, for what the EU might subsequently do with India. So let's make our deal as good and as big and as generous. Of course, we've got to cover Scotch whisky, we've got to cover IT workers from India. We know what the big wins are, but let's make it big and generous, because we need inward investment into the UK and trade with India, hugely beneficial to us. But also, India needs, whatever, 10, 12, 15 million jobs being created every year, good jobs and good businesses investing and growing in your country. So it's win-win, but we should both put more on the table. We should both take a bit more risk, in my view, and take some political risk, including domestically, because ultimately this will be a win for both countries and a big win for India, because it'll set the standard for your deal with the EU.
You talked, of course, of the geopolitical shifts and India's new status really at the high table. But when we look at the moment, perhaps, where the West perception shifted of India, when do you think that actually happened? Was it India's strong insistence on going its own, the India way, when Ukraine happened, the UK, the US weren't very happy with that in the beginning? When do you think the perception shifted of India being a global player to reckon with?
I think it's a difficult question. There have been so many moments in India's recent history which have woken people up to the potential of this great country. I mean, the opening in 1991, the different approach that was taken. I think the moment when it was clear India's population would overtake China, I think that was a very big moment. Obviously, this huge green transition and green investment, that's important. The lunar mission, I mean, that was an extraordinary moment for India, one where the whole world saw what the potential of India is. My answer, though, would be a bit more parochial. I remember when I came here as leader of the opposition and then as Prime Minister, one time it was in the year where Indian investment into the UK overtook Japanese investment because of the massive investment in Jaguar Land Rover. And here was this great, iconic business, Tata, and obviously mourning the loss of Ratan Tata, who was an advisor to me as Prime Minister. But an Indian company coming into Britain, taking over one of our most famous car brands, but investing in it, growing it, improving it. That to me was a real wake-up moment for this economy has arrived on the global stage and is going to be one that's going to do great things.
One of the big, exports, I say, to the UK from India is Indian students. I mean, I think we make up the highest cohort of international students. Yet the anti-immigration rhetoric, the whole aspect of, say, squeezing visas, there is some feeling that the UK still remains resistant to what is good for the UK as well, because after all, it's Indian students' fees.
Of course,
the rise of Nigel Farage and the right as well.
But I wouldn't confuse for 1 minute those two things. I mean, as matters stand today, there are no limits on the number of Indian students that can come to British universities. They have to have an English language qualification, and they have to have a place at a British university. And we want as many to come as possible because it's a great industry for us. It also builds great connections between Britain and India with the growth that you are forecast to have. I think it would be helpful actually to take the student numbers out of the immigration figures altogether.
Yes.
Because the truth is most students that come to Britain, they come, they study, maybe they work for a year or a little bit longer, and then they come back to India. So counting them as part of the net migration figures only really makes sense when you're trying to work out who stayed after a whole university course. So I think we should simplify the figures, welcome as many who want to come. But at the same time, we do, like other countries in Europe, we do have to deal with this problem of illegal migration. People aren't concerned in my country about how many students come. They welcome the students. But we are concerned that every day at the moment, hundreds of people are arriving in small boats from the French coast, and they're from Syria or Vietnam or Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan, and that's the real problem. If we could deal with the illegal migration, we would find it much easier to advertise the benefits of the legal migration, particularly the students, who, as I say, in my view, should come out of the numbers altogether.
You've been mentioning Ukraine, but just to look at what's currently happening in Israel, the Gaza conflict, you just said recently in an interview that you had actually suggested sanctions on Israeli ministers. Do you stand by that, and do you think
I mentioned two specific ministers. In the Israeli government, there are two ministers who, and I've watched what they've been saying, they have been encouraging people to stop aid trucks getting into Gaza, and they've been encouraging violent settlers in the West Bank to continue their attacks on the Palestinians that live there. That is unacceptable. And my argument was that I was looking at that as Foreign Secretary. I didn't quite have time to do it before my time came to an end. I think that would have been a better answer than a partial arms embargo, because at the moment we have to be frank about the wider conflict here. Israel is not only under attack from terrorists to its south, Hamas in Gaza, but also terrorists to its north, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and is also under direct attack from the state of Iran, that has now launched two of the largest missile attacks in history against Israel. So for Britain to have an arms embargo against Israel when it's under those sorts of attacks doesn't seem to me to be a sensible policy, whereas actually targeting extremist ministers in an Israeli coalition government is actually a better way of getting our message across. And I do think that's an important point to make.
We talk about a reset, but we're looking also at the Tory party and a reset. You had that year of 3 prime ministers. Did you ever think you would see Tory prime ministers tumble like cards, as it were? And how do you think you will recover? You've got a Labour government with a very good mandate. You've got the rise of Farage.
Yeah.
Can the Tories recover?
Yes, is the short answer. It will take some time. It'll take a lot of hard work. But I think we had this, as I say, Rishi did a good job, but he was taking over from a situation which I think was very hard to recover from. What we have now is a new government. I wish them well. Winston Churchill always used to say, I never attack the British government when I'm abroad, I make up for it when I get home. But but for my own party, we have to rediscover what we did between 2005 and 2010, where we reached out to new audiences, we came up with new policies, we had a compelling vision for why we should be given a chance to serve our country. We've got to do that all over again. And we have some exciting candidates standing for that leadership, and I wish them well. And although when I became leader of the Conservative Party in 2005, it was so long ago that actually, I remember the other day, the iPhone hadn't been invented when I became a party leader. So I can't pretend I have all the answers, but I'm certainly available to help them if they want some help.
Okay, that's any friendly advice for the Prime Minister of the UK?
I think the most important thing, and your Prime Minister demonstrated it so clearly today, the most important thing in politics is to have a plan. Have a very clear plan for how you're going to grow your economy, how you're going to improve the infrastructure, how you're going to do the green transition. Because what you find in politics is that you become Prime Minister, and then everything hits you at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And if you don't have a very clear plan about what you want to do, you get endlessly distracted by the short-term problems and difficulties. So, and I think what we've seen with Prime Minister Modi is such a clear plan about green India, about clean India, about made in India, about technology and the future of your country. There's a plan. Mm-hmm. And that's what we need in Britain to get our growth rate up, to get our infrastructure better, to get the green transition right, a clear plan, and then stick to it as much as you can. Democracies are noisy and difficult and disputatious, and that's important. That's what we love about them. Mm-hmm. But the more you have the plan, the more you can get back to it as soon as the noise abates.
So, Lord Cameron, shifting away from all the geopolitics, soft power, and India's soft power is a huge asset currently. Tell me, who's your favorite Indian cricketer? I know you're a cricket fan, and so from the English side, you may not watch.
I'm so old that I grew up watching Bishan Bedi. But I suppose the moments I've watched great cricket players, I watched Rahul Dravid score an amazing century in the UK. I remember that very clearly. I remember sitting with John Major, actually, another Conservative Prime Minister who's even more cricket obsessed than I am. And he said, watch this guy, he's really very, very good. I think in Virat Kohli, you had an extraordinary leader. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you can see, as we have done now with Ben Stokes, our captain, just incredible leadership on the field and inspiration. And I think you had that with Kohli. So lots of great cricket players to watch. And obviously some very good British Indian talent coming through. Yes. You may see in years and decades to come that you'll see more and more British Indian players coming on and taking on India and hopefully winning.
A British Indian captain.
And we won't mention New Zealand, the test at the moment. I'll
yes.
stay out of that.
Have you ever watched a Bollywood movie?
I had the great pleasure of meeting Aishwarya Rai when I was Prime Minister. And I like to think the film's actually called Dave Das rather than Dev Das. But I'm a big admirer of hers and that extraordinary Hollywood family. I suppose the most recent film I've watched about India was Hotel Mumbai, which is such a harrowing portrayal of the terrible events that happened there,
yes.
and a reminder of how your country has suffered from terrorism just as we have done. And I think it's one of the things that should bring us together is recognizing that, yes, we've got a war in Ukraine, we've got wars in the Middle East, but we still have this challenge of defeating extremist Islamist terror, which affects your country, affects my country, and we should never forget about how many lives have been lost from that, certainly in the time when I was Prime Minister, not just in the UK, but around the world. But the problem still exists.
Yes, absolutely. And finally, well, I know Indian food is now, British food, but your favorite Indian dish, and do you like it medium spicy or extra hot spicy?
Well, one of the things in lockdown, I thought I must do something useful, so I taught myself how to cook curry. And my speciality is a Kerala fish curry. Okay. I had a wonderful holiday in Kerala many, many years ago with my wife, just around the millennium. And I remember the food being amazing. And so I can now do my very own Kerala fish curry. And quite hot.
Okay. Lord Cameron, it's been absolutely wonderful to talk with you. And as you say in politics, never say never. We look forward to what's your next avatar in British politics.
Thank you very much. It's been great being with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Cameron.